Every time I get bewitched by your spell, I figure that it's high time to talk to you and find out what makes you tick on the inside.
Well, I mean, just say some nice, fine, beautiful people listening and good relaxation. Makes me tick on the inside.
Imagine being so popular that your record label secretly releases music you never approved. Then you take them to court, risk your career, and win. That is exactly what happened to Erroll Garner. At the center of this story is a uniquely powerful partnership: Erroll Garner and his manager, Martha Glaser. Together they learned how to push back against the music industry, walk away from bad deals, and force companies to treat them with respect. In a time of open racism and deep power imbalances, a black pianist and a Jewish manager stood side by side and refused to be intimidated. They understood contracts, they understood leverage, and they were not afraid to call the industry's bluff. Their struggle came to a head with a groundbreaking lawsuit. Erroll Garner and Martha Glaser took Columbia, one of the most powerful record labels in the world, to court. The company responded with a countersuit in federal court, which meant Erroll had to put up a $40,000 cash bond. Friends and supporters stepped in to help him raise the money, but the decision still carried enormous risk. In a statement at the time, Erroll said he paid the bond because he believed the case was not only about his own rights, but about the rights of others working in the recording and music industry. He hoped that what he was doing would lead to greater security for all artists and their creative work. The cost was immediate and severe. Erroll Garner was effectively blocked from recording for about 2.5 years, right in the middle of his prime. Those missing years left a hole in his discography at a moment when his visibility and influence were at their strongest. Some observers believe that this long silence is one of the reasons he is not praised today as much as some of his contemporaries. And the recording that made him immortal, it almost never happened. It was 1955. Carmel by the Sea, California, a repurposed military building perched above the ocean. The piano is mediocre, the acoustics are rough. A local broadcaster sets up a tape machine on a whim, expecting nothing more than a decent evening of music. What he captured instead was lightning. Columbia Records heard that tape, cleaned it up, and released it as Concert by the Sea. It became one of the best-selling jazz albums in history, over $1 million in sales before the decade was out. For millions of listeners around the world, it was the first jazz record they ever owned. But this is not the story of a famous album. This is the story of what fame does to a man who never asked for it, what it demands, what it devours, and what it leaves behind when the applause finally stops. Erroll Louis Garner was born on June 15, 1921, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, into a working-class black family where music filled every room. By the age of 3, he was already at the piano, copying melodies his older siblings played and reproducing them by ear with startling accuracy. By 7, he was performing on local radio. He never learned to read music, not as a child, not ever. He had no formal training, no conservatory education, no sheet music on his stand. Instead, he developed something rarer, an entirely intuitive relationship with the instrument. Every song he played existed as a living, flexible thing he could reshape at will. In 1944, Garner arrived in New York City. 52nd Street was the beating heart of jazz, packed with clubs where bebop was being born. Musicians like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie were pushing the art form into angular, complex new territory. Garner's style stood out immediately. While other pianists chased bebop's racing lines, he fused older and newer traditions into something completely his own. His left hand drove a powerful guitar-like rhythm, pulsing like an entire rhythm section. His right hand floated slightly behind the beat, teasing phrases, delaying resolutions, creating a playful tension that felt both deeply relaxed and intensely swinging. In 1947, he even recorded with Charlie Parker himself. But Garner never became a bebop musician. He ran parallel to the mainstream, always recognizably himself. By the early 1950s, Garner was no longer just a musician's musician. He was becoming a star. He led his own trios, headlined prestigious venues, and built a following that stretched far beyond the usual jazz audience. His combination of virtuosity, humor, and accessible melody made him irresistible. And then Concert by the Sea changed everything. Released in 1956, it introduced Garner to millions of listeners who had never set foot in a jazz club. Suddenly, he was one of the biggest names in American music. He could sell out concert halls. He could headline festivals across the United States and Europe. His music reached people who simply loved a good melody and a good groove, whether they knew anything about jazz or not. But popularity is never just applause, and for Erroll Garner, it came with a price that the audiences in those concert halls never saw. Even a glance at Garner's surviving correspondence reveals just how wide his world had become. The archives at the University of Pittsburgh contain letters and exchanges with a remarkable list of figures: Count Basie, Cole Porter, Langston Hughes, Alfred Hitchcock, Johnny Carson, Clint Eastwood, Wynton Marsalis, Eleanor Roosevelt, and President Harry Truman. This was not a musician operating on the margins. This was a man whose artistry placed him at the center of American cultural life. And yet, the same fame that opened those doors also trapped him in a cycle of obligation, expectation, and constant negotiation over his own work. Of all the music Erroll Garner created, one composition came to define him in the public imagination, and, in a painful irony, also eclipsed him. He composed Misty in the mid-1950s and first recorded it with Mitch Miller's orchestra in 1956. It became a jazz and pop standard covered by countless singers and instrumentalists, and eventually ranked among the most performed songs of the 20th century. But for many people, Misty became separated from its creator. They knew it from vocal versions, from radio, from Clint Eastwood's 1971 thriller, Play Misty for Me. But they did not always know that the song came from the imagination of Erroll Garner. His music had become more famous than his name. And behind the scenes, Garner and Martha Glaser spent years navigating the complexities of how his work and his name were used in connection with the film. Yet another negotiation, yet another fight for control. The battle with Columbia did not happen in a vacuum. It was shaped in part by the way Erroll Garner was portrayed in the media. In the late 1950s, a major national magazine published an unflattering profile of him. They emphasized that he was self-taught and that he could not read standard musical notation. They painted him as a cheerful but simple figure, suggesting that he was out of touch with reality and uninterested in serious matters. In one anecdote, they claimed that when someone mentioned Bach, Erroll supposedly thought they were talking about a kind of beer. They described him as illiterate and implied that he had no involvement in financial or business decisions. In that telling, the mainstream press reduced him to an idiot savant, a brilliant childlike figure rather than a thoughtful professional. But there was another narrative. In the black press, his legal struggle made the front pages. There he was celebrated as clear-minded, articulate and intelligent, a David standing up to a corporate Goliath. From that perspective, his case was not just about a contract, it was also a civil rights story, a challenge to a system that routinely exploited black artists while denying them power and representation. Over time, commentators have come to see what Erroll Garner did as a turning point. He demonstrated that artists could fight for ownership and control of their own recordings and win. He showed that a musician did not have to accept whatever a label decided to do with their work. Years later, in the early 1980s, Martha Glaser and a Columbia executive exchanged letters reflecting on what had happened. In that correspondence, Martha insisted that the lawsuit had always been about more than money. The executive admitted that he often wondered how an artist in Erroll Garner's position, with serious legal disputes and huge artistic and commercial importance, would be treated by modern lawyers and corporate executives. He acknowledged that Erroll was likely the first black artist, and perhaps the first artist of any background, to directly challenge a major record label at a time when black performers struggled even to secure effective legal representation. He also pointed out that the public knew almost nothing about the case while it was happening, because Erroll's attorney insisted on no publicity for the entire 3 years of litigation. As a result, Garner's recording career remained frozen in the background, while his fans heard only the music, not the fight behind it. Even today, there is still more to learn about who Erroll Garner was and what he accomplished. A modern pianist, acting as a creative ambassador for his estate, has described his mission as bringing Garner's music to new listeners by reimagining it on contemporary stages. He notes that Erroll was ahead of his time in many ways. Musically, he moved fluidly among classical influences, jazz improvisation, popular song, and Latin jazz, long before such crossovers were common. Socially, he pushed boundaries too. In an era marked by open racism and segregation, a black artist working closely with a Jewish manager made a quiet but powerful statement. Martha Glaser was active in civil rights efforts and brought that sensibility into every aspect of their work. Together, she and Erroll insisted on fair treatment, challenged discriminatory practices, and used contracts to fight back against exploitation. They were willing to say no, willing to walk away, and willing to risk their own comfort to protect what mattered. To understand how daring that was, you have to remember where Erroll Garner was coming from. The backdrop to this story is the 1950s, when he was at the height of his powers. He was winning major jazz polls and international awards. He stood at the top of his profession. In that context, Martha Glaser negotiated a remarkable deal with Columbia, a contract that gave Erroll final approval over any recordings released under his name. That kind of clause was almost unheard of at the time. By then, Erroll Garner was already a major asset to the label. In 1956, Martha Glaser secured a 5-year contract for Erroll with Columbia, and by 1960 she was working on renegotiating the terms. It was at that moment that the label began issuing material from Garner's large archive of studio recordings without seeking his permission. A prominent producer and talent scout had just returned to the company after some time away, and Erroll reached out to him by telegram. In 1960, he sent a sharp message demanding that the album's swinging solos be withdrawn from the market. He stated that Columbia had gone ahead with its release despite his written notice that the tracks were not authorized and did not meet his standards. He expressed disbelief that the label had issued the record at the very moment when his manager was meeting with the executive, and when they were being assured it would not be released. In that same message, Erroll Garner asked a blunt, painful question. Was the label treating him this way because he was a black artist they thought they could push around? He demanded that all sales and distribution stop immediately, and that copies be recalled from journalists, radio stations, and record stores. For him, it was not only about his own reputation. He believed the release undermined the artistic integrity of every musician signed to the label. From there, the conflict only escalated. Erroll Garner and Martha Glaser decided they would not accept what had been done to them. They took Columbia to court. The company responded with its countersuit, the bond, and a long legal fight that froze his recording career. But in doing so, Erroll and Martha forced the industry to confront a question it had largely ignored. Who truly controls the music, the label, or the artist? The Erroll Garner story is not just a story about a great pianist. It is a story about power, courage, and the hidden cost of standing up for your own work. At the height of his fame, he risked everything to say no, and in the end, he helped change what was possible for artists who came after him. Through the 1960s and into the 70s, Garner kept performing and recording even as the jazz landscape shifted around him. He wrote music for the 1963 film a new kind of love. He released new albums. His style remained unmistakably his own, even as fashions came and went. But the years of constant work, relentless travel, business conflicts, and the accumulated stress of a life spent fighting for control of his own art had taken their toll. By 1975, his health had deteriorated enough that he was forced to stop touring. The piano that had been the center of his life since the age of 3 fell silent. On January 2nd, 1977, Erroll Garner died in Los Angeles from cardiac arrest. He was 55 years old. Today, the Erroll Garner Jazz Project and the archives at the University of Pittsburgh work to preserve his legacy. In those files, we find not only the joyful performer captured on record, but also the contracts, letters, and legal documents that reveal how hard he fought to maintain control over his own art. When we listen to Erroll Garner, it is tempting to hear only the joy, the laughter at the piano, the playful delays in the melody, the sense that the music itself is smiling. But behind that sound stood a man who lived the full consequences of his own popularity. Endless touring, business conflicts, battles for respect, and a constant pressure to live up to the image his records had created. He turned his imagination into a global language of happiness and swing. He gave audiences around the world the feeling that joy was just a few notes away. He fought for his rights as an artist and won precedents that would benefit musicians for decades. And yet, above all, he remains what he always was at the piano, a source of pure, unfiltered joy.
You know, every time I get bewitched by your spell, I figure that it's high time to talk to you and find out what makes you tick on the inside.
Well, just say some nice, fine, beautiful people listening and good relaxation. Makes me tick on the inside.